The 2026 Formula One season just started, and the first qualifying session may already have triggered a massive controversy. George Russell just destroyed the field in Australia. Pole position, a full Mercedes front row, and a gap of almost 8/10 to the next fastest car. In modern Formula One, that kind of advantage almost never happens. And now, several teams are asking the same question. How is the Mercedes engine suddenly this fast? Because after qualifying in Melbourne, rival teams started looking much deeper into the data. Top speed comparisons, energy deployment traces, hybrid recovery patterns. And some engineers believe what they saw could explain why Mercedes looked untouchable today. Which is why teams are now pushing the FIA to examine the Mercedes power unit much more closely. Because if the advantage really comes from the engine or the hybrid system, this could become the first major technical investigation of the 2026 season. And what the FIA finds next could completely change the fight for the championship. The moment the cars rolled out for qualifying in Melbourne, something already felt different. Throughout the practice sessions on Friday, engineers across the paddock had been quietly watching the timing screens. Not because the gaps were small, but because the gaps were growing. And almost every time a long-run simulation appeared on the monitors, the same car kept coming out on top. Mercedes. George Russell's race pace simulations were immediately noticed by rival teams. Some internal estimates suggested his long-run pace was nearly half a second per lap faster than several competitors. In Formula One terms, that is an enormous margin. At first, many teams believed it might simply be fuel load differences. That happens often during practice sessions. One team runs heavy fuel, another runs light, and the lap times become misleading. But when qualifying arrived, the picture suddenly became much clearer. Mercedes was not just quick in race simulations. They were fast everywhere. Russell looked comfortable from the very first run. The car was stable entering corners. The rear remained calm under braking. And the acceleration out of slow corners looked extremely strong. But the most noticeable detail appeared on the straights. Every time the Mercedes exited a corner, the car seemed to gain speed faster than its rivals. Small advantages at the start of the straight. Then slightly larger gaps halfway down the straight. And by the braking zone, the difference became obvious. That pattern immediately caught the attention of several rival engineers. Because in modern Formula One, acceleration differences often reveal something important about the power unit. Not just raw engine power, but how the hybrid system delivers electrical energy. The 2026 regulations have made the hybrid component more important than ever before. Electrical deployment now contributes a much larger percentage of total power. Which means efficiency inside the energy recovery system can completely transform how fast a car accelerates. If a team can harvest energy more efficiently under braking, they can deploy more power on the next straight. If their battery management is more advanced, they can maintain that power longer during the lap. And if the system is perfectly optimized, the driver receives strong acceleration almost everywhere. That is exactly what the Mercedes appeared to show in Melbourne. The car looked incredibly smooth when deploying power. No hesitation. No visible drop in speed. Just a constant, clean surge of acceleration. And that kind of performance naturally raises questions inside rival garages. Because Formula One teams analyze everything. They study GPS traces. They compare corner entry speeds. They examine how quickly rivals accelerate after the apex. And when those numbers start showing unusual advantages, the discussions begin. Inside Ferrari, engineers quickly noticed the difference. Charles Leclerc admitted after qualifying that Mercedes looked extremely strong and clearly ahead of the field at this stage of the season. Red Bull reached a similar conclusion. Even before the incident involving Max Verstappen during qualifying, the team already believed Mercedes had executed the new regulations better than anyone else. From their perspective, the Mercedes package looked like the most complete car in Melbourne. Fast over one lap. Fast in long runs. And incredibly efficient with its hybrid systems. But the size of the advantage was what really triggered concern. Nearly 8/10 of a second between Russell's pole lap and the next non-Mercedes car. That margin is enormous in modern Formula One. Especially at the first race of a new regulation cycle. And whenever a performance gap appears that large, other teams begin asking very careful questions. Not accusations. Not immediately. But questions. How are they deploying their electrical energy? How efficient is their harvesting system? How stable is their power delivery? Because sometimes the smallest technical details can produce the biggest advantages. And in a sport where every thousandth of a second matters, even a tiny efficiency gain can decide championships. Which is exactly why the discussions around the Mercedes power unit have started so quickly. Not because teams are certain something is wrong, But because the performance we saw in Melbourne was strong enough to demand a closer look. And as engineers across the paddock continue studying the data from qualifying, one question keeps coming back. Did Mercedes simply build the best power unit of the new era? Or did they find something in the hybrid system that the rest of the grid still hasn't understood? But the real tension in the paddock did not start when Russell took pole. It started a few minutes later, when engineers from other teams began comparing the telemetry traces from qualifying. Because modern Formula One teams have extremely powerful analysis tools. Even without direct access to another car's data, they can reconstruct a surprising amount of information. GPS overlays, speed traces, throttle application, energy deployment patterns. And once those traces from Melbourne started circulating inside the garages, one detail immediately stood out. The Mercedes acceleration curve looked different. Not dramatically different at first glance, but smoother, more consistent. Almost as if the car never ran out of electrical energy during the lap. Normally, hybrid deployment in Formula One comes in phases. Drivers receive a burst of electrical power on the exit of corners. Then the system gradually reduces output as the battery drains along the straight. But when engineers compared the traces from the Mercedes to the rest of the field, something interesting appeared. The power delivery seemed to last longer. The car continued accelerating strongly even toward the end of long straights. And that kind of behavior can only happen if two things are working extremely well: energy harvesting and energy management. The hybrid system must recover enormous amounts of energy under braking, then store it efficiently, then deploy it at exactly the right moment during the lap. If any of those stages are inefficient, the driver runs out of electrical power before reaching the braking zone. But the Mercedes did not appear to suffer from that problem. Instead, it looked like the system was delivering maximum power almost everywhere. Which immediately raised another question inside rival teams. How are they harvesting that much energy? Because the braking zones in Melbourne are limited. There are only a few major opportunities to recover electrical energy during the lap. And yet the Mercedes seemed to have more power available than anyone else. That observation quickly became one of the main discussion points inside Ferrari. Their engineers began examining GPS data from every qualifying run, comparing entry speeds, comparing exit speeds, comparing energy deployment patterns between Russell, Antonelli, and the rest of the grid. And the conclusion was simple. The Mercedes power unit looked incredibly efficient. Possibly the most efficient system on the grid. That realization alone is enough to make rivals nervous. Because once a team gains a major advantage in hybrid efficiency, it becomes extremely difficult to catch. Power units are tightly regulated. Development is limited. And even small improvements can take months to replicate. Which is why discussions about the Mercedes engine quickly moved beyond simple curiosity. Some engineers began asking whether the team had discovered a particularly clever interpretation of the new regulations. Something within the rules, but perhaps operating in a gray area. That is exactly the type of situation where teams ask the FIA for clarification. Not because they are certain something illegal exists, but because they want to understand exactly how a rival system works. And if necessary, whether the governing body believes it complies fully with the technical regulations. Those conversations are already starting to circulate quietly inside the paddock, especially after the scale of the gap in qualifying. Because if Mercedes really has found a breakthrough in hybrid efficiency, the consequences could be enormous. It would mean stronger acceleration, better energy recovery, and more consistent performance over a race distance, all of which become decisive advantages over a full season. Meanwhile, Mercedes themselves appear completely calm. Russell described the car as extremely balanced, stable under braking, strong on corner exit, and very predictable to drive. For a driver, that combination is perfect. Confidence grows quickly when the car behaves exactly as expected. And that confidence was obvious during Russell's pole lap. Every braking zone looked clean. Every corner entry looked controlled. The car simply did what the driver asked. Antonelli's lap told a similar story. The young driver placed the second Mercedes right beside Russell on the front row. A perfect 1-2 for the team. And a powerful statement at the very beginning of the 2026 season. But inside rival garages, the celebrations looked very different. Ferrari engineers continued studying the numbers. Red Bull strategists reviewed every speed trap reading. And across the paddock, the same question kept appearing in quiet conversations. Did Mercedes simply build the best engine of the new era? Or did they discover something in the hybrid system that the rest of the grid still has not figured out yet? Because if the answer to that question turns out to be true, then what we saw in qualifying today might not just be a fast lap. It might be the first sign of a completely new competitive order in Formula One. And that is where the situation becomes even more interesting. Because qualifying in Australia did not just reveal a fast Mercedes. It revealed a gap that immediately changed the mood across the paddock. Nearly 0.8 of a second separated George Russell from the next non-Mercedes car. In modern Formula One, where teams often fight within 2 or 3 tenths, that margin feels enormous. For Ferrari, the message was clear almost immediately. Charles Leclerc admitted after the session that the Mercedes looked extremely strong and that Ferrari was currently one step behind the benchmark set by Russell and Antonelli. Inside the Ferrari garage, engineers described the situation with a mixture of respect and concern. Respect, because Mercedes clearly executed the new regulations extremely well. Concern, because that kind of performance gap is difficult to close quickly. The new power units are incredibly complex machines. They combine combustion engines, advanced electrical systems, battery technology, and extremely sophisticated software. And once one team discovers an advantage in how those systems work together, it can take months for others to catch up. Red Bull faced a similar realization. The team arrived in Australia already expecting Mercedes to be strong. Pre-season testing had suggested that the Silver Arrows might have understood the new hybrid regulations better than most of their rivals. But seeing that advantage confirmed in qualifying made the situation much more serious. Because now the performance difference was visible to everyone. And when that happens in Formula One, the technical questions begin immediately. Teams start analyzing every possible factor.